Ethan had never been able to quiet his thoughts at night. The restlessness always came when the world outside seemed hushed, when the street lamps flickered over empty sidewalks and every sound inside his head grew sharper. That evening was no different. He had spent the day wandering between obligations and silence, but as night settled, his body refused to calm. When Oliver messaged him, suggesting he come over, Ethan agreed before thinking twice. The offer seemed harmless, just another late-night visit to his closest friend, but a part of him felt the subtle tremor of anticipation. Oliver lived with his father in a wide, two-story house on the edge of town. Ethan had been there countless times before, yet lately, walking into that house left him unsettled. The reason was not Oliver, who remained as open-hearted and familiar as ever, but Richard, Oliver's father. Richard carried himself with a presence that demanded attention. It was in the way he stood, shoulders firm and voice even, as though the air shifted when he entered a room. Ethan had noticed it months ago, but in recent weeks the awareness had deepened into something more dangerous that he told himself he should stop thinking about it. Richard was older, Oliver's father, and recently divorced. Nothing good could come from the curiosity tugging at Ethan's thoughts. Yet it persisted, threading through his mind with every visit. Tonight, he promised himself, would be different. He would sit with Oliver, talk about nothing, maybe share a drink, and let the hours drift until morning. Nothing more. The drive to Oliver's house was quiet, the kind of stillness that deepened the more Ethan tried to distract himself. By the time he parked on the curb, he was already rehearsing casual words in his head, anything that would steady him if Richard appeared. The porch light glowed faintly as he approached, and when the door opened, Oliver greeted him with the same boyish grin he had worn since college. "Man, you made it," Oliver said, stepping aside. His hair was slightly tousled, his voice easy. "Figured you'd be too tired." "Tired, maybe," Ethan replied, forcing a smile, but I wasn't about to say no. The living room was warm, scattered with books and half-folded laundry, traces of an ordinary night. Ethan felt himself relax as Oliver moved about, grabbing 2 cans from the kitchen and tossing one to him. For the first hour, they sat side by side, talking about sports, work, and trivial things that filled the silence. It was comfortable, familiar, the way their friendship always had been, but then Richard entered. He didn't announce himself, he never did. He walked in with a calmness that seemed deliberate, dressed simply in a dark t-shirt that revealed the strength of his build. His eyes, sharp yet unreadable, lingered on Ethan a fraction longer than politeness required before shifting to his son. "Didn't expect company tonight," Richard said, his tone casual but steady. "Yeah, just hanging out," Oliver answered easily. "You don't mind, right?" Richard's mouth curved into a faint smile. "Of course not. Always good to see you, Ethan." The words were simple, but Ethan felt the weight behind them. His throat tightened, and he nodded with practiced restraint. "Good to see you too, Mr. Hale." "Richard," the man corrected gently. "I've told you before, Richard is fine." Ethan's chest stirred with a warmth he quickly disguised by taking a sip of his drink. Oliver seemed oblivious, continuing to chat as Richard settled into a chair across the room. Ethan tried to focus on his friend's words, yet every few minutes his gaze betrayed him, flickering toward Richard. The older man's presence filled the space without effort, his quiet composure somehow louder than any noise. As the night stretched on, Oliver grew drowsy. His laughter softened, his words slurred with fatigue, until finally he excused himself. "I'm crashing," he said, standing and stretching. "You know where the guest room is?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, I'll be fine." Richard rose as well, not to leave but to gather a glass of water from the kitchen. Ethan watched him disappear through the doorway, pulse quickening with every second. He knew he should follow Oliver upstairs, settle into the guest room, and end the night quietly. That was the sensible choice. But when Richard returned, the pull in Ethan's chest kept him rooted on the couch. The older man placed the glass on the table, his eyes meeting Ethan's with measured calm. For a brief instant, silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Then Richard broke it with the ease of someone who understood how to control the rhythm of a room. "You and Oliver still as close as ever?" he said, more observation than question. Ethan nodded. Yeah. He's been like a brother to me since college. Richard's expression flickered, almost imperceptibly. Good to know he has someone he can trust. The words landed with unexpected weight. Ethan's chest tightened, caught between guilt and something else, something less innocent. He lowered his gaze to the can in his hand, now empty, and set it down. Yeah, trust is important, he murmured. Richard gave a slow nod, as though the remark carried layers neither of them wanted to unravel just yet. The clock ticked softly on the wall. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, a dark veil over the quiet street. Ethan felt acutely aware of the stillness, of Oliver asleep upstairs, of Richard only a few feet away. The atmosphere was thick with a kind of expectation he didn't dare name. Finally, Richard stood, his movements deliberate. Don't stay up too late, he said, his voice lower now, almost personal. You'll need some rest. Ethan looked up, finding the man's eyes fixed on him with quiet intensity. For a fleeting second, it felt like the world narrowed to that gaze alone. Then Richard turned and walked down the hall, leaving Ethan to the silence once more. Ethan's breath came unsteady. He told himself it was nothing, that he was imagining it, that Richard's words were no more than fatherly courtesy. But deep down, he knew better. Something had shifted tonight, subtle yet undeniable. As he finally made his way to the guest room, the weight of that realization followed him. He lay awake long after settling into bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to dismiss the memory of Richard's gaze. For the first time, Ethan admitted to himself that this night would not pass like the others. Something had begun, and he wasn't sure he wanted to resist it anymore. Sleep refused to come. Ethan lay flat on the mattress in the guest room, staring at the ceiling as though it held answers he could not form into words. The faint hum of the house carried through the walls, pipes groaning, wood settling, a clock ticking somewhere down the hall. Every sound sharpened against the silence, reminding him that Richard was only rooms away. That thought lingered like an uninvited guest at the edge of his mind, persistent and impossible to shake. He turned on his side, eyes fixed on the faint stripe of moonlight cutting across the floor. If he closed his eyes, Richard's face returned in startling clarity, the lines carved by age, the steady composure in his expression, the weight of his gaze. It wasn't just attraction. It was the dangerous allure of something forbidden, something tied to Oliver's trust. Ethan clenched his fists in the sheets, muttering to himself that it was wrong, that nothing would happen. Still, his body remained tense, restless. Minutes stretched, blurring into an hour. Finally, surrendering to the ache of wakefulness, Ethan sat up. His throat was dry, and he told himself he needed water, an excuse that soothed the guilt gnawing at him. Quietly, he opened the door and stepped into the hall. The house was darker here, shadows pooling against the walls. He moved slowly, careful not to wake Oliver, his bare feet silent on the carpet. The kitchen light glowed faintly when he reached it, not bright but enough to cast a soft halo against the tile. Richard was already there. The older man stood by the counter, one hand braced on its edge, the other wrapped loosely around a glass. He looked up as Ethan entered, his eyes catching the light in a way that seemed deliberate, though perhaps it wasn't. Couldn't sleep? Richard asked, his voice even, quiet, as though meant for this hour. Ethan hesitated in the doorway. Yeah. I just needed some water. Richard gestured toward the cupboard. Glasses are on the left. You know that by now. Ethan moved forward, each step heavy with the awareness of proximity. He retrieved a glass, filled it at the sink, and drank slowly, trying to ignore the thrum in his chest. Yet the silence pressed in again, thick with possibility. Richard's gaze lingered. It happens to me too. Nights like this. The house feels louder somehow when everyone else is asleep. Ethan glanced at him. Yeah. That's exactly it. The exchange was simple, but beneath it ran a current neither dared name. Richard's posture was relaxed, but his eyes held a sharpness that unsettled Ethan. You've been spending a lot of time here lately, Richard remarked after a moment, his tone casual but edged with meaning. Ethan shrugged. Oliver's been good company. Helps to have someone around. And you? Richard asked, tilting his head slightly. Do you feel like you have someone? The question landed heavier than Ethan expected. He thought of past relationships, half-hearted attempts that fizzled before they began, and the quiet loneliness he never spoke aloud. His throat tightened. Not really, he admitted, the words hushed. Richard studied him for a beat too long. I figured. Ethan set the glass down, fingers tracing its rim to occupy his hands. How did you figure? Your eyes, Richard said simply. They look for connection, but they hide too much at the same time. Ethan's breath caught. He had never heard anyone describe him like that. For a moment, he couldn't decide if he should be grateful or unnerved. The silence stretched again, heavier now. Richard's presence filled it effortlessly, as though he understood the effect he had. Ethan felt the pull deepen, subtle but undeniable, drawing him closer to a line he had no business crossing. Divorce teaches you things, Richard said finally, voice quieter, almost reflective. Loneliness has a way of creeping in when the house gets too still. You notice things you used to overlook. His gaze held Ethan's, steady and searching. Sometimes you notice people. Ethan's pulse quickened. The words were not blatant, yet they carried weight enough to shake him. He swallowed hard, searching for something to say, but nothing came. His silence seemed to speak louder than words. Richard shifted closer, not touching, but the distance between them shrank to something intimate. You don't have to say anything, he murmured. I just want you to understand, you're seen. The simplicity of the statement unraveled Ethan's restraint. For years he had buried parts of himself, hiding them under layers of friendship, politeness, and fear. To hear those words now, from Richard of all people, left him vulnerable in ways he hadn't prepared for. He should have walked away. He knew that. Oliver slept upstairs, trusting Ethan's presence in this house without hesitation. Yet the gravity of the moment pinned him in place. Richard's hand brushed against his as he reached for the glass on the counter. The touch was slight, fleeting, but it ignited something undeniable. Ethan drew in a sharp breath, eyes darting to Richard's face. The older man's expression remained calm, yet his gaze burned with unspoken intent. This isn't right, Ethan whispered, voice barely audible. No, Richard agreed softly, but sometimes what feels wrong is the only thing that feels alive. Ethan's body betrayed him, leaning ever so slightly closer, caught in the magnetic pull. His heart pounded, torn between loyalty and desire, fear and need. Every rational thought screamed for distance, but his chest ached for the very opposite. The kitchen seemed suspended outside of time, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the stillness. Ethan searched Richard's face, finding both restraint and hunger there, a mirror of his own turmoil. You should go back to bed, Richard said at last, his voice steady but strained. Before we cross a line we can't take back. The words carried weight, yet no movement followed. Ethan remained rooted, staring at him, waiting for a shift he wasn't sure he wanted. Richard's hand lingered on the counter, close enough that Ethan could feel the warmth radiating from it. I don't want to sleep, Ethan admitted, the confession spilling out unguarded. Richard exhaled slowly, as though holding something inside had grown unbearable. Then we have a problem. Neither man moved for several long seconds. The moment teetered on the edge of something irreversible, each heartbeat driving them closer. Ethan's chest rose and fell rapidly, his breath shallow. He knew the next step would shatter the friendship he had built with Oliver, but the pull was relentless. Richard's eyes never left his, steady and consuming, until Ethan felt himself unraveling under the weight of them, and then Richard turned away, abruptly, breaking the spell. He reached for his glass, finished the water in a single swallow, and set it down with deliberate calm. Get some rest, Ethan, he said, his voice low but firm. Tomorrow will feel different. The sudden distance cut through the tension like a blade, leaving Ethan both relieved and hollow. He nodded slowly, though his legs felt unsteady as he backed toward the doorway. As he returned to the guest room, his mind reeled. Nothing physical had happened, yet everything had changed. Richard's words, his touch, his gaze, none of it could be undone. Ethan lay back in bed, staring again at the ceiling, but this time with the echo of Richard's voice in his ears. Tomorrow might feel different, but tonight had already marked him, and as his eyes finally grew heavy, he knew with certainty that the line between trust and betrayal had already begun to blur. The first gray light of morning had not yet touched the curtains when Ethan awoke, his mind still wrapped in fragments of the night before. The memory of Richard's words lingered, heavy and insistent, like a dream too vivid to fade. He lay still for a long while, staring at the muted ceiling, wondering if he had imagined it all, the charged silence in the kitchen, the brush of Richard's hand, the voice that told him he was seen. But his chest confirmed what his mind tried to deny, the restless thrum of his heart insisted it had been real. The house was quiet. Oliver remained asleep upstairs, his steady presence untouched by the turmoil that had unfolded just beyond his awareness. Ethan slipped from the bed, bare feet pressing softly against the floor, drawn not by thirst this time but by something far less defensible. He told himself he only needed clarity, a conversation to dissolve the tension that had taken root. Yet beneath that reasoning churned a deeper truth. He wanted more of what he had nearly tasted. The kitchen was empty, dim with the faintest trace of dawn creeping through the window. Ethan poured himself water, though he barely drank, his ears tuned for the slightest sound. When footsteps approached from the hall, his pulse leapt. Richard entered, hair slightly disheveled, his t-shirt loose on his frame. He paused when he saw Ethan, surprise flickering across his face before it settled into something more composed. "You're up early," Richard said, voice low, roughened by sleep. "Couldn't stay in bed," Ethan admitted, though his tone carried more meaning than the words alone. Richard stepped into the kitchen, the air between them tightening with each inch of closed distance. "Neither could I." For a moment they simply looked at each other, the silence more articulate than speech. The faint light caught the edges of Richard's face, softening his features but not his gaze. Ethan felt his restraint faltering, the line between choice and inevitability thinning with each breath. "I kept thinking about last night," Ethan confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard's eyes darkened. "So did I." The admission was both dangerous and liberating. Ethan set his glass down, his hand trembling against the counter. "I know this is wrong," he said, the words spilling out quickly, as though saying them might anchor him. "Oliver, he trusts me. You're his father. This shouldn't even cross my mind." Richard closed the distance, his presence steady, immovable. "You think I don't know that? I've told myself the same thing 100 times. But Ethan," his voice dropped, rough with restraint. "Wanting doesn't disappear just because it's forbidden." The words ignited something in Ethan he could no longer contain. He had spent months burying his desires, convincing himself they were shadows, nothing more. Yet here they stood, face to face, stripped of pretense. Richard lifted a hand, hesitating for a heartbeat before brushing his knuckles lightly against Ethan's jaw. The touch was fleeting, but it shattered whatever remained of Ethan's resolve. His breath hitched, his body leaning into the contact he had tried so desperately to avoid. The kiss that followed was quiet, almost tentative, but it carried the force of all their restraint breaking at once. Ethan's world narrowed to the warmth of Richard's mouth, the firm grip at his waist, the taste of inevitability. For a moment, time fractured, leaving only the pull between them, raw and consuming. When they parted, Ethan's chest rose and fell rapidly. He stared at Richard, searching his face for regret, for hesitation, but found only the same hunger reflected back. "This can't happen again," Richard said, though his voice betrayed how little conviction lay behind the words. Ethan swallowed, throat tight. "It already has." The sound of footsteps on the stairs jolted them both. Oliver's voice, groggy and distant, called out, "Dad? You up?" Panic surged through Ethan. He stumbled back, nearly knocking into the counter. Richard moved quickly, reclaiming his composure with practiced ease. By the time Oliver appeared in the doorway, Richard stood at the sink, rinsing his glass, while Ethan held his own as though he had been drinking the entire time. "Morning," Oliver said, rubbing at his eyes. "You two are up early." "Couldn't sleep," Richard replied smoothly, his tone calm. "Same here," Ethan added quickly, forcing a smile. "Figured I'd get some water." Oliver yawned, oblivious. "Well, I'm going back to bed for a bit. Don't let the coffee pot run dry when I wake up." He shuffled back toward the stairs, the sound of his footsteps fading. Ethan exhaled sharply, shoulders tense. His pulse still raced from the near discovery, from the kiss that burned like a secret against his lips. Richard turned off the tap, setting the glass aside, then faced him again. His eyes were steady, but the weight behind them carried both warning and promise. "This is dangerous," Richard said quietly. "I know," Ethan whispered, though his body betrayed him with its closeness, with the way his gaze refused to break. Richard's jaw tightened. "But it's already too late, isn't it?" Ethan said nothing, but his silence answered more than words could. The line they had feared crossing was gone, erased in a single breathless moment. What remained was the uncertainty of what came next. The day would rise soon. Oliver would wake, coffee would be brewed, and the ordinary rhythm of life would resume. Yet beneath that routine, a secret now pulsed, fragile and consuming. Ethan felt its weight pressing against his chest, thrilling and suffocating all at once. He left the kitchen before the sun fully broke through the windows, retreating to the guest room. But as he lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, he knew there was no return to the simplicity of before. Last night had unsettled him. This morning had changed him. One kiss, hidden and forbidden, had rewritten the trust of a friendship, the silence of a house, the course of a heart, and as Ethan closed his eyes, he realized with haunting clarity that nothing between him, Oliver, and Richard would ever be the same again.